So this proof that we're going to review has a given piece of information with a midpoint. I want us to remember that in order to prove triangles are congruent, we need to have 3 congruent statements. Right now, we have 1 congruent statement here, and that's a given. I'll mark that on my triangles. That's segment AB congruent to segment BC. My other given statement isn't a congruent statement, so I need to use this statement to somehow get a congruent statement. At the beginning of the chapter, or at the beginning of our proofs section of the chapter, we talked about what midpoint tells us. The midpoint of segment AC means that segment AM and segment MC are congruent. I'm going to write that down up here so I know what my congruent statement is going to be. That's what the midpoint tells me. There's my second congruent statement. I can't go and start my proof yet, though, because I don't have a third congruent statement. 2 things we always look for in our triangles, in our diagrams. One is vertical angles, and the other is the reflexive property. In this case, both triangles, ABM and triangle CBM, share side BM. That's the reflexive property. I mark that. I now have 3 congruent statements marked. I write somewhere up here my third congruent statement. That segment BM is congruent to segment BM. That's my third congruent statement. Once I know those 3 congruent statements, I now have enough to write my proof, and I can tell how many steps my proof is going to be. I'm going to have 1 step or 1 statement for my proof, being that M is the midpoint. My next statement is going to be what that means, my congruent statement. So that's 2 steps. My third step is another given. My fourth step is the reflexive property. Once I have all 3 of these in my statements category, I can write my final step, which is my proof step, and that's that the triangles are congruent. So this will be a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-step proof. Let's go ahead and get started writing it. Always use your givens. So first, M is the midpoint of segment AC. And I always have to give a reason. This is, if it's one of my given statements, my reason is given. Always take that next step. Work with every given until you have a congruent statement. That's not a congruent statement, so I have to go with my next. That leads me to this congruent statement. That segment AM is congruent to segment MC. I need a reason for that. That's the definition of our midpoint. We talked about that the first day on your guides sheet. On that guides sheet, we said that we have to write as our reason for these segments being congruent the fact that the midpoint divides the segment into 2 congruent segments. I now have my first congruent statement in my proof. Circle it, highlight it, put a star next to it, do something so you know you are going to have a visual cue as to when you are completed with your proof. You're not done until you have 3 statements that are congruent in your statements. Okay. So I've used this, I've used this, I have to put my next one. Segment AM is congruent to segment BC. I know that because it's right here, it's my given statement. So I can use my given as my reason again. Circle or highlight or star, you have a second congruent statement. We're almost there. Number 4 is the reflexive property. So segment BM is congruent to segment BM. My reason is the reflexive property. That's my third. Once you've circled 3 or highlighted 3 or put a star next to 3, that's enough. You now have your 3 congruent statements. You've proven that these triangles are congruent. So my last step is always my prove statement. In this case, triangle ABM is congruent to triangle CBM. The last tricky part is to identify which reason. We have learned 5 reasons. side, side, side congruence, side, angle, side congruence, angle, side, angle congruence, angle, angle, side congruence, and HL congruence. It's a process of elimination. If I look at my diagram, I have to ask myself, do I have 3 sides congruent? In this case, I do. I don't have any angles marked. Everything that I have marked, and it's often easier if you hide one of the triangles and look at just one. Don't worry about both. Look at one triangle. I have a side, and here is a side again. That has to be side, side, side congruence because I don't have any angles. So I can't use this, can't use this, can't use this, can't use this. It has to be side, side, side congruence. That's the final reason I put in here, side, side, side congruence. And we're done. Please, if you have questions, come in for help, review, rewind, keep looking at this video to get yourself settled.